Hello everyone, welcome back. Today we'll be looking at key concept 5.2.2, the political causes of the Civil War. So we're going to look at a lot of stuff basically after the Mexican-American War leading up to the very eve of the Civil War, and our next one will be about the war itself. So today we're looking at a lot of causation, a lot of cause and effect, basically kind of setting up a timeline and a narrative and a progression for why the Civil War occurred. It's kind of step by step as we lead right up to it. So let's jump on in. All right, first thing we need to talk about, something I mentioned before that we would be talking about later, now is later. So we talked about the Mexican-American War already and how it was going to create a debate over slavery, because suddenly, if you look at that map on the upper right, the land we gained from the Mexican-American War was California, and those two areas in that kind of reddish rust color, the Utah Territory and the New Mexico territories. And basically, that land, the South is going to view it as available for slavery because it's towards the south of the country, right? We had other rules governing slavery, but they're saying it needs to be changed now because we have more land that's been acquired. So let's look at some of these debates as to what should be done. Now, one of the biggest things that happened to decide what should be done with this land was the Compromise of 1850. Okay, we've had the Missouri Compromise since 1820, and this lasted about 30 years without any major changes. Both sides agreed that it was good enough to get the job done, but it worked because there weren't any major territorial gains that were causing an imbalance. Suddenly, most of this land is above the 3630 line, and the South is now saying, well, that doesn't give the chance for the spread of slavery, so it's not fair. There's not kind of this equal balance. So what was decided with the Compromise of 1850? One was that there should be popular sovereignty in the Mexican cession. Okay, California would enter as a free state, there'd be a stricter fugitive slave law, and the slave trade would be outlawed in Washington, D.C. itself. So all of these are trying to create this balance that is going to create a compromise that will neither please each side completely, but prevent a further sectional conflict. So let's look at each of these elements. So Mexican cession, again, is that area in the rust color, the red color. That means popular sovereignty would exist in both. But if you look, let me bring in my little pointer thing. 3630 line goes along right here. And what that means is that there can now be slavery in this land north of the 3630 line. So essentially, we are replacing the Missouri Compromise. It is thrown away. It is gone. Okay? But it appeased the South and allowed the expansion of slavery. All right, next up, California would enter as a free state. California wanted to enter as a free state from the very beginning. Remember, as part of James K. Polk's campaign promises, and that got done. Stricter fugitive slave law, I'll talk about a lot about it in just a second. This last one, pretty straightforward, slave trade outlawed in D.C. So this was kind of like a concession for the North. They didn't want slavery to be so visible in the national capital, despite the capital being in the South. But still, they could go right outside of D.C. in Virginia or Maryland, and slavery was allowed in terms of the trade. All right, Fugitive Slave Act, as I said earlier, we're talking about it now. It was a part of this compromise. So keep in mind that the Constitution had preserved slavery from the very beginning with the use of the Fugitive Slave Clause there, saying that any escaped slaves or just fugitives that went into another state had to be returned from the state from which they came, but the North never really enforced this law because they, over time, they disagreed with slavery more. They didn't have it, so they saw no need in order to enforce it. What happened, though, is there were no consequences for them not enforcing it. This Fugitive Slave Act, as part of the Compromise of 1850, created consequences for noncompliance. How did the North respond? They passed state laws at that level called personal liberty laws. The idea here was that they were told they have to enforce it, but then they made laws that weren't going to arrest people or give consequences for them if they actually broke the law. So this is the idea of nullification. Remember, this idea goes all the way back to the Alien and Sedition Acts during John Adams. It comes up again under Andrew Jackson with the nullification crisis over tariffs in South Carolina. It's not a new idea, but what this does is, because the Fugitive Slave Act is being more enforced, it's causing more of a tension. And now if Northerners feel like their state rights are being threatened and violated because they have to enforce slavery, which they disagree with. All right, two more things dealing with how to deal with the expansion of slavery. One was the Gadsden Purchase. We'll watch a funny video on this in class. It was essentially, going back to the map, this little area right down here that just goes a little bit into what was Mexico back then, but is South Arizona and New Mexico today. We really wanted it because we wanted to build a transcontinental railroad to connect the Pacific Ocean all the way to the Midwest and then the Atlantic Ocean. But what was happening is the land that we got going through Arizona and New Mexico there was very rocky, and it was not conducive toward building a flat railroad. But if we got the land just south of that, it would have been better. So we bought it as a southern path for this. We never used it for that because by the time we were building it, we were in the middle of the Civil War. Okay, the South was gone, and the North and the federal government no longer felt the need to appease the South by building a transcontinental railroad that was going to service them as well as the North and the Midwest. Lastly, the Austin Manifesto. This was an attempt for further expansion to buy Cuba from Spain. So it never happened. This manifesto was never even made into a formal document. It was just kind of a draft. Typically they say it was made by James Buchanan. I'll mention him in a little bit. But the North finds out about this, and they say the federal government's trying to appease the South, trying to create more land below 3630 so that slavery could expand down there. Essentially, this was planned by Democrats from the North who said, we need to find more ways to make the South feel like slavery isn't being threatened. It wasn't really being threatened, but they felt like it was being threatened. So, further appeasement, this never happened. We'll talk about Cuba when we get to the Spanish-American War next time. All right, so a couple more ways that we lead up to the Civil War, dealing with all these controversies. This time, looking at how the courts and the national government found ways to try and appease both sides. So we already saw the Compromise of 1850 on the former slide. Now we're going to look at further ways that this argument came up and the federal government tried to keep the peace between the North and the South. Dealing with sectionalism. So, first one here is the KansasNebraska Act. This was the idea of someone named Stephen Douglas. I'll bring up his name again later in this slide and on our last slide as well. So, we had this area, the Nebraska Territory, that came from the Louisiana Purchase. It wasn't really settled yet, but there was room for states there. Based on former rules, it was only open to free states. Stephen Douglas was a Northern Democrat who proposed that this territory be broken up into two new territories instead of one, the Kansas Territory and the Nebraska Territory. Nebraska Territory would not allow slavery. Kansas Territory would allow slavery. Now, as states would be created from any of both of those, popular sovereignty would decide. So we'll eventually see in just a minute that as Kansas gets enough people and wants to become a state, it was now up to popular sovereignty to decide would it be free and would it be slave. And this led to a large conflict down there. This was another instance of overturning the Missouri Compromise, so now slavery could exist north of the 3630, just like the Compromise of 1850 stated. So let's talk about Bleeding Kansas. I mentioned it before in another slideshow dealing with John Brown. What happened is Kansas applied for statehood, but with popular sovereignty, it was up to the people living there to vote, was it going to be a slave state or a free state? So what happened is people start moving to Kansas en masse in order to be able to vote on that. So people from Missouri, people from northern states as well, because they wanted to make sure that the state went the way they wanted. So what happened was violence in the streets. This was very much a microcosm of what the Civil War will become in the future. People defending that it should be a slave state, people defending that it should be a free state. So there was really violence on both sides. Eventually the vote happens, and Kansas is decided to be a free state, but the people in favor of it being a slave state disagree, and they set up their own capital, all right, where they set up their own government, kind of like a rogue government, that's trying to say, no, we're the valid government because we're going to be a slave state. It's not until during the Civil War that Kansas becomes a state and it enters as a free state in the middle of the Civil War. Okay? What this shows us, though, is the problems of popular sovereignty. It sounded like a quick fix before of saying, take it off our hands, federal government won't decide, we'll leave it up to the states. You have states' rights, sure. But then when it actually went into effect and tried to carry it out, clearly there were people on both sides who were very strong in their beliefs and willing to be violent in order to effect those into actual actions. All right, another huge thing you need to know, the Dred Scott decision. This was a Supreme Court decision, Dred Scott versus Sanford in 1857. So let me tell you the story here. Now what happened is Dred Scott was a slave who had lived in the North and sued all through the court system up to the Supreme Court, arguing he was free because he had lived on free soil. What happened is he was a slave from Missouri, from somewhere in the South, and his master moved up into Illinois and then into Minnesota and took him with him to be a servant. But Dred Scott said, well, I've lived up here a long time and there's no slavery allowed here. How can I be a slave living on free soil? So he, an abolitionist, took the court case up to SCOTUS, so that's the Supreme Court of the United States, and they said the ruling they made really changed the playing field. So they didn't just tell him he was free or he was a slave. They said that based on the Constitution, and everything they said was constitutional if you look at it back then, that blacks, free or slave, were not citizens of the United States, so they had no right, no guarantee from the Bill of Rights to sue in the courts. So they didn't say to him, you're free or you're slave. They said, well, we're not even going to make a ruling on that because you as a black person have no rights. You have no right to sue in court. Some of the language they actually use is blacks have no rights that whites are bound to respect. So they said, even if we as the court determined that black people do have all these rights, it wouldn't matter because most white people wouldn't support them. So essentially, the Supreme Court is kind of giving up on this idea of providing more equality, but on the same hands, all their arguments, if you look at it, are 100% constitutional. The Constitution defended slavery from the very beginning. It had the Fugitive Slave Clause, has the Three-Fifths Clause. It has all these instances that protect the institution. So it seemed like an attempt to get more equality for slaves and for blacks, and it didn't go that way. Now what happened in the North was absolute outrage, because what happened with this decision is it determined that the end of the line, the law was that people from the South could bring their slaves up north, and there were no consequences. Northern states that had outlawed slavery for decades now had to let slavery exist in their land, which, if you think about it, suggests that states' rights really wasn't a thing to do with the causes of secession. Okay, in the South today, a lot of people argue that it was all about states' rights. Well, if it was so about states' rights, why were Southern states willing to not have the Northern states' rights be accepted for them to disallow slavery? I'll let that question hang there. Okay, so causes further sectional divide and further tensions. Now, something within this time period too, we go back to Stephen Douglas, and he debated an up-and-comer named Abraham Lincoln. So Lincoln at this point had served in Congress in the House of Representatives. He did not get reelected. In 1858, he was running for the Senate against Stephen Douglas, a Northern Democrat. And what they arranged were debates to sort of reveal the arguments for and against the spread of slavery. Now, Douglas was trying to keep like this moderate stance of saying, well, slavery can expand, but it should be up to popular sovereignty. I'm not going to tell you what to do. Northern Democrats kind of had to play both sides to appeal to their region and appeal to their party, which was down in the South. So they have several of these elections. Douglas is the one that actually wins it, so Lincoln loses, but he gets national attention, and he was a gifted speaker and writer, and these debates get published widely enough that people know who Lincoln is when we move into the election of 1860. Now, what happened to Douglas as well, he may have won, but he kind of lost. He won the battle, lost the war in the end, because he made statements about popular sovereignty trying to appeal to the North as well that outraged the South. what he proclaimed was something that he called the Freeport Doctrine. And this said that, well, if you live in a state or a territory where the Dred Scott decision has now allowed that you have to allow slavery, you can actually minimize the effect of slavery by having no laws to protect the institution. So no laws that prohibit what black people are allowed to do, no laws that give the slave owners rights within their property. So essentially he was trying to find a backdoor to say slavery can expand with popular sovereignty, but there's ways to limit it too if you want to vote for me and don't like slavery. The South got mad about this. They thought he was on their side as a Democrat, and it's getting to this point where the Democratic Party actually splits in two, the Northern Democrats and the Southern Democrats, which is going to sort of doom them when we get to the election of 1860, which we're just about to get to. In a couple slides, I suppose. Oops. Okay, so first we need to talk about what politics had been like in this antebellum period. Antebellum means before the war, before the Civil War. And one element of this was the dismantling of the second party system. The second party system had the Democrats and the Whigs. Now, election of 1848, a Whig is elected the presidency. He's another one of these hero generals, this time from the Mexican-American War. He dies 2 years into his office. His vice president takes over, a very forgettable president, but with a memorable name, Millard Fillmore. It's quite a name. Okay, there's really not much to say about those 4 years because the rest of the federal government was controlled by the Democrats, so the Whigs in the presidency didn't really get much done. So by 1852, the Whig Party had died out. Its two major leaders, Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, from Congress had both died. They didn't have a direction or sort of a head to lead their parties anymore. And what this leads to within the ensuing years up to about 1858 is very powerful democratic government, controlling all three branches of the federal government, ensuring that there's really no change when it comes to the issue of slavery and the issue of its expansion. Examples of this are the two presidents from this time period, Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan. They're both considered to be historically very ineffective presidents. So this is the time period when we're going all the way from the early days of the Compromise of 1850, Kansas, Nebraska, the Dred Scott decision, Bleeding Kansas. All this turmoil is happening on their watch, and they do nothing about it. Okay, so they essentially saw the sectional conflict growing and not going away, and just kind of twiddled their thumbs. They didn't do anything. They're very forgettable, except for the fact that they did nothing. Memorable things about them from today. Apparently, back when Pierce was president, all the ladies thought he was so handsome, but every time I bring this up in class, all my students go, yeah, I don't see it. Whatever, that's the interesting thing. Interesting about James Buchanan is he's considered to be the only gay president. So he certainly wasn't out, it wasn't in the open, but if you study kind of all the primary sources about his life, it becomes fairly apparent that he was gay and in a relationship with a partner for most of his adult life. Okay, all sort of very hush-hush, obviously. All right, so second party system had failed, democratic leadership all throughout the 1850s, but in 1856, a new party forms, the Republican Party. And what the Republican Party does is it's kind of this conglomeration of all these smaller parties. The Whigs that had broken up, remember the Free Soil Party from before that objected to slavery, but not on moral grounds, but because they didn't want it to affect white jobs, and abolitionists. Essentially, the Republican Party combines all these anti-slavery leanings into an anti-slavery party. So all of them could agree, and it's kind of like this jigsaw puzzle, putting them all together under one banner, which is going to be a problem for the Democrats, because before, opposition was very fragmented, and now they have all united in one party, which is going to turn the tables and get us closer to the Civil War. Republican Party combined the interests of the North and the West. They favored the expansion of industry. They favored free labor in the West, which appealed to business owners with the expansion of industry, and it appealed to the working class with more land open for moving into the West. Okay, that anti-slavery part also appealed to the more radical elements of the abolitionists. Meanwhile, in the South, I say that all the time, the Democrats split, okay? Because of this disagreement on whether slavery should expand anywhere or popular sovereignty should decide, they split into Northern Democrats, Southern Democrats. They have different candidates for national elections from there on, and the division of the Democratic Party leads to the Republican Party ascending, because instead of dividing, they were now united. So we see in the 1858 midterm elections, the Republicans, they take back either the House or the Senate, I can't remember which one, and basically Democrats looked at that and said, we've controlled Congress, at least one house, for how long? This is not good if this party is going to gain more power in 2 years, which is exactly what happened and leads to the Civil War. All right, our last slide. I want you to notice something on the left-hand side. It mentions Abraham Lincoln in red. You gotta know him. He's one of the few presidents mentioned by name. And it also mentions his election in 1860. There are only 2 elections mentioned in the entire curriculum. The election of 1860 and the election of 1980. So you better know what happened in this election and what all the issues were that were going on. And there it is. The election of 1860 had 4 candidates. Okay, Abraham Lincoln, Stephen Douglas, John Breckinridge, and I think his first name was John Bell. Okay, Lincoln is a Republican. He's from Illinois. He supports that slavery should not expand. Okay, Douglas is a Democrat from the North. I've mentioned him before. He thought slavery could expand, but only with popular sovereignty. John C. Breckinridge he was from the South. He'd been vice president under James Buchanan. He was in favor of it spreading anywhere. John C. Bell, I think was his middle name C? I don't know. John Bell was from a brand new party called the Constitutional Union Party. All he said on any issue was, I will do anything to keep this country from splitting apart. So if that meant getting rid of slavery, he'd do it. If that meant making slavery expand everywhere, he'd do that too. Okay? Now, because there's 4 candidates, it splits up the Democrats into regional groups and essentially helps elect Lincoln. If you look on the side, it says that Lincoln won without any Southern electoral votes. In many Southern states, he wasn't even on the ballot. The Republican Party wasn't formed down there. So someone wins even though the South, none of it wanted him, if you actually look at the map up there on the upper right. All right, now what happens the month after Lincoln is elected, South Carolina secedes. They break away, they draft articles of secession, they draw on ideas from the Declaration of Independence, and announce that they are forming their own country. Now remember the nullification crisis again. South Carolina was the state that threatened to secede if the federal government didn't change its tariff laws. It's the same sort of issue going on as to why they broke off here. Now, what happens soon after in the next month is another 6 states secede. So I like the alliteration here of 7 southern states secede. It's kind of a tongue twister too, but the first states to secede are all in the deep south. So look at the map on the bottom right over here. What we have is the states in blue are the first to secede. Why, you may ask? They have this nice buffer zone between the North and them, so they can form the Confederacy and not worry about having war on their back door. Okay? All this time, James Buchanan was still president, but he was a Democrat. He was pretty ineffective. He didn't do anything to try to bring them back or to stop them from going. He essentially tells Lincoln on his way out, good luck with all of this. I'm glad it's not my problem anymore. Okay? So you can see why he's viewed as pretty ineffective. Didn't try anything. So Buchanan didn't try anything to stop the South from leaving, but Congress did. So what Congress did is they tried to create a compromise called the Crittenden Compromise. Okay? Now, it was an attempt to prevent war between the North and the South and bring back the states that were in rebellion. So their proposition was they would add an amendment to the Constitution that would restore the 3630 line and mention slavery by name and further protect it constitutionally. Remember, before it was protected constitutionally, but it never uses the word slavery. This compromise was willing to take that extra step and say, we will put slavery into the Constitution by name and make sure it's protected in the South from any future further infringements. Now, it didn't work. Lincoln ran against the spread of slavery. This compromise might have allowed that, and so because the president or the future president refused to support it, it didn't get anywhere from people in his own party as well. And that's why it's important, sort of, let the president can kind of direct legislation and decisions, and if the president doesn't support it, the supporters of the president won't support it either. So you can see this was a last-ditch attempt to keep the South, and it did not work. Now, the way the Civil War formally begins is on April 12th, 1861, about a month after Lincoln takes office. Begins in South Carolina, the first state to secede. Now, the issue here was there was this place called Fort Sumter. It was a Union fort, so a federal government fort that was stationed in Charleston Harbor off the coast of South Carolina. But South Carolina had seceded, so there were all these federal troops there from the United States military that if they tried to leave, they'd be fired upon. If anyone tried to go to the island, they'd be fired upon. And they were running out of supplies. They couldn't eat anymore. So Lincoln wanted to resupply them in order to, help them stay alive. He communicated to the Confederate government that, do not view this as an act of war. I'm only sending in food and supplies to keep them alive. The South interpreted it as an act of war. It's kind of like, remember the Mexican-American War, where we were waiting for Mexico to fire first? The South was waiting for the Union, the North, to do something first, and they said this was enough of an attack by trying to send in ships to the fort. The South attacks, they seize the fort, no one dies, so it was a pretty bloodless affair, but because it looked like the federal government was trying to interfere in the South, a few more states secede, so the ones in purple right here, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia secede because they're thinking that the issue is coming closer to them. They were on the sort of indecisive whether they were going to secede before. Now, I want you to notice the other states that are there in that kind of orangish color. These are the border states: Maryland, Missouri, Kentucky, and Delaware. They decide to stay with the Union, but they had slaves. The slavery was a system there, and this is the importance. For the Union, for the North, it creates a barrier with the Confederacy, with the South. And it also, there's major rivers like the Ohio River and the Missouri River that run right through there. If those states had favored the South would have had control of those rivers and made transportation very difficult for anything for the Union. So, this was why Lincoln was very careful about his stance on slavery during the election. He said, I'm against it, but I'm not going to get rid of it. I just don't want it to expand. And this was the idea that helped maintain the border states there. So they stay, but Lincoln was worried about propaganda and sort of pro-Confederate ideas eventually leading those states to leave and join the Confederacy. So things he takes with executive orders as president: he suspends habeas corpus. So habeas corpus means you have to be told why you've been accused of a crime. You have to be presented the body of evidence. This is suspended in border states, so you could be arrested and put in jail without being told why. Okay. The other thing that happens is he shuts down freedom of the press for pro-Confederate newspapers so that those ideas couldn't be disseminated and spread. So realize, during wartime, the president has some leeway to take actions like this, even though these are essentially kind of these rights enshrined in the Constitution. In wartime, the president takes actions to limit those. We'll see it again with Woodrow Wilson in World War I, FDR in World War II. It's really nothing new in this case. So it's important that we look at Lincoln as a very effective politician. He's very much viewed as a martyr today because he gets assassinated, but when you look at his actions and stances as president, he was a calculating politician who knew how to walk a very thin line to get support from multiple sides. All right, next time, the Civil War. Thank you for watching as always. You've got some note cards to do, red or yellow terms only, one per slide. Don't forget to do your quiz by 8 a.m. tomorrow, and maybe make a useful question to put on your point of confusion. That would be nice. Work on your super fun geography assignment due on the day of the unit test. Study chronology, study geography, and you can get ahead by watching the next video if you want. I think it's a more lengthy, longer one, so just be aware of that. Alright, this is Mr. Chodola signing off. Thank you as always for watching, and I'll see you in class. Bye.